For 9 months, I looked my husband in the eyes every single night. At dinner, across pillows, in the ordinary quiet of a shared life, I looked at him directly, without flinching, without looking away, while carrying something inside me that would have destroyed him to know. People talk about guilt like it announces itself, like it arrives with shaking hands and a voice that cracks. Mine didn't. Mine was silent and still, and I carried it so cleanly that there were entire weeks where I almost forgot it was there. Almost. The almost is the part I have never been able to fully explain, the sliver of awareness that stayed present no matter how well I managed everything else. Before you judge me, tell me where you're watching from, because I have judged myself more thoroughly than anyone watching this could manage. Stay with me, drop a comment, tell me where you are, because what I'm about to tell you is the most honest thing I have ever said out loud. My husband's name was Patrick. We had been married for 3 years when it happened, together for 5 before that, 8 years total, which means he was the person who knew me across my entire adult formation. He knew the 22-year-old I was when we met and the 30-year-old I had become, and he had loved every version of me in between with a consistency that I mistook, for too long, for something ordinary. His love was not ordinary. I understand that now, with a clarity that arrived too late to do either of us any good. We met in the final year of university through a shared seminar group. He was studying economics, I was studying literature, and we argued about a novel during a group discussion in a way that somehow became the beginning of something neither of us had planned. He was precise where I was instinctive. He was structured where I was fluid. We fit together in the way that opposite temperaments sometimes fit, each filling what the other lacked, each finding in the other something they hadn't known they needed until it was present. For the first 4 years, the marriage was genuinely good. We moved into a flat we gradually made into a home. We navigated careers and family pressures and the ordinary negotiations of 2 people building a shared life. We had our arguments, real ones, the kind with weight, and we resolved them, and the resolution always left us slightly more known to each other than we had been before. I was proud of us, in a quiet and private way. Proud of the thing we had built, and the care we had both put into building it. But year 5 introduced something I did not have a name for at the time and have spent considerable effort naming since. A flatness. Not a crisis, not a rupture, just a slow, gradual loss of altitude. Like a plane that has stopped climbing and is flying level, perfectly functional, going nowhere new. Patrick had settled into himself in ways that were admirable and also, for reasons I am still not entirely proud of, quietly claustrophobic to me. He knew what he liked. He knew how he wanted his evenings to go, his weekends to unfold, his future to be shaped. The certainty that had once made him feel like safe ground began to feel, to some restless part of me, like a ceiling. I tried to name it. I feel like we've stopped surprising each other, I said one evening. We were on the couch, the television on low, the kind of evening that was comfortable and unremarkable and had become the primary texture of our week. Like we know each other so completely that there's nothing left to discover. Patrick turned toward me. He gave the comment genuine consideration, the way he gave most things genuine consideration. "Is that a problem?" he said, knowing each other completely. Not in itself, but I think I need to feel like I'm still growing, like we're still growing. "Then let's grow," he said, simply, practically. "Tell me what that looks like and we'll do it." And that was the gap, right there in that exchange. What I needed was not a plan for growth. What I needed was for him to feel the restlessness I was feeling and meet me in it spontaneously, without being asked, without it being organized. I needed to feel that he was as unsettled as I was, that the flatness was something he also felt and was also reaching beyond. And instead he offered me logistics. He offered to solve it. And his willingness to solve it was, paradoxically, part of what made me feel more alone. I did not tell him that. I said, "Let me think about what that would look like." And I let the conversation close, and the flatness continued. His name was Ren. I met him at a literary festival I attended for work. I was in publishing by then, and festivals were part of the professional landscape. And for 3 days every year, I moved through a world that felt more alive and more native to me than almost anywhere else I spent time. Books and writers and ideas moving through the air at a particular velocity. I was always more myself at those events than I was anywhere else, which should perhaps have told me something about the widening gap between who I was in my daily life and who I needed to be. Ren was a writer. Not yet a celebrated one, he had one well-received debut novel and the kind of quiet reputation that exists in literary circles before it migrates anywhere larger. He was at a panel I was attending professionally, and afterward, at the drinks reception, we were introduced through a mutual colleague, and within 20 minutes were standing apart from the group, having the kind of conversation that makes everything around it recede. He talked about writing the way I had always thought about reading, as an act of radical honesty, as the only form in which certain truths become bearable. He was interested in my perspective not in the flattering, performed way of someone trying to impress, but in the genuine way of someone who was actually curious about how another person experienced the thing he loved. He asked questions that went somewhere. He listened to the answers and built on them. He made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like the most interesting person in the room. I drove home from the festival on the third day, and I told Patrick it had been a good professional event. I did not mention Ren. The omission felt small, manageable, a detail not worth raising. He emailed me, a week after the festival, a professional email, technically, about a book of mine he'd heard discussed at the festival that he wanted to read. I replied. He replied to my reply. The exchange had a warmth to it that I registered and did not address, because addressing it would have required me to make a choice I was not yet ready to make. We met for coffee in October, 6 weeks after the festival, in the city where we both happened to be for separate reasons. I told Patrick I was having lunch with a colleague. Not a full lie, I was having lunch with a colleague earlier in the day. I simply extended the story to cover an hour of coffee that the story had no business covering. The coffee was 2 hours. It was the most fully alive I had felt in months. Not because anything inappropriate happened, nothing did that day, but because the conversation was the kind I had been missing without fully naming what I was missing. He spoke about his second novel, which he was struggling with, and I spoke about the manuscripts I was working on, and somewhere in the middle of it we stopped talking about work and started talking about everything else. Fear, ambition. The specific loneliness of feeling like the person you're closest to doesn't fully see the most restless, complicated parts of you. Do you feel seen? He asked, direct, no softening around the edges. I sat with the question. Sometimes, I said, not always, not in the way I need to feel seen. By your husband. I looked at him. I shouldn't answer that. Probably not, he said, but you just did. I drove home that evening, and I sat in the car outside our building for 15 minutes. Not because I was deciding something, because I already had, somewhere between the coffee and the drive, without formally announcing it to myself. And sitting in the car was my last private moment before I walked inside, and the weight of what I had decided became something I had to carry invisibly. What followed over the next 4 months was the most demanding performance of my life. I do not use the word performance lightly. It was precisely that, a sustained, detailed, exhausting act of presenting a self to Patrick that was complete and authentic in its surface and hollow in its center, because the center of me was somewhere else, with someone else, in conversations and connections that I was conducting in the spaces between my actual life. Ren and I met when we could, which was not often, once, sometimes twice a month, in the logistics of a life that required careful management. Between meetings, we communicated through channels I had arranged specifically to be invisible. I became organized in a way that I had never been about anything else, which is its own particular indictment. The effort I put into not being caught was effort that belonged, by every right, in my marriage. Patrick asked me twice during those months whether I was okay. Not in the casual, passing way, in the real way, the way that meant he had noticed something he couldn't name. The first time was in November. We were getting ready for bed, that particular intimate domestic window where guards are generally down, and he looked at me with a thoughtfulness that had always been one of his defining qualities and said, "You're somewhere else lately. Even when you're here, you're somewhere else." I turned to face him. I had become good by then at meeting his eyes. "I've just been absorbed in work," I said. "The list I'm managing right now is genuinely overwhelming." Is that all it is? Yes, I said, without hesitation, without looking away. He held my eyes for a moment, then quietly, "Okay, tell me if it becomes more than that." "I will," I said. The second time was in January. Different question, same concern underneath it. "Are we okay?" he asked. Mid-conversation about something else, the question arriving without setup. "Why?" I said, giving nothing. "Because I love you, and I want to make sure we're okay. Do I need a more complicated reason than that?" And in that moment, in that specific, uncomplicated, generous moment, I felt something I had been managing carefully crack slightly open. I looked at my husband, who loved me without condition or complexity, who asked if we were okay simply because he loved me and wanted us to be, and I felt the full weight of what I was doing to him from the inside of a face he trusted. "We're okay," I said. The discovery happened in February, not through a found message or a confrontation, through a coincidence so ordinary it is almost banal. Patrick ran into a mutual acquaintance who had seen Ren and me together at a cafe 2 weeks earlier. A brief mention, no malicious intent, just the casual sharing of information between people who had no idea it mattered. Patrick came home that evening and set down his keys and said, with the careful control of someone who has been thinking about a thing for hours, "I need to ask you something." I knew from his voice. Before the question formed, I knew. "How do you know Ren Calloway?" There are moments in a life where the preceding months compress into a single point, where all the choices and the management and the maintained surfaces collapse simultaneously into one unavoidable now. This was that moment. I looked at Patrick, my husband of 3 years, partner of 8, the person who had loved every version of me I had been, and I understood that the next thing I said would determine the shape of everything that came after. I told him the truth. Not managed, not framed, not delivered in the version that preserved my dignity. The plain truth from the festival forward. Every meeting, every deliberate omission, every evening I had looked him in the eyes and said I was fine, I was here, we were okay. Patrick did not react with the dramatic devastation of a television scene. He sat very still. He listened to all of it. When I finished, he was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. Then he said, "You looked me in the eyes." 3 words with a particular inflection that meant he was not asking whether I had done it. He already knew I had. He was asking me to understand what that meant, what it said about the nature of what had occurred between us. Not just the betrayal itself, the sustained, deliberate act of maintaining his trust as a mechanism while quietly withdrawing from the thing it was supposed to protect. "I know," I said. "For how long?" 9 months. He closed his eyes, opened them. 9 months, he repeated. "Yes." He stood up from the table. He went to the bedroom and he closed the door, and I heard nothing for a long time. Here is the secondary thing, the thing I had not prepared for, that arrived 2 weeks after Patrick asked me to leave and I was staying with my sister, sitting with the consequences of the previous 9 months. Ren called me. And in that call he told me something he had not told me before, that he had been in a relationship when we met. That the girlfriend he had mentioned, in passing, early in our acquaintance, as someone from his past, had in fact been present throughout. That he had ended it, recently, but that it had existed across the same months I had been managing my own parallel life. That he had not been the honest, complicated, fully seeing person I had been telling myself he was. He had been, in at least one significant way, precisely what I had been. I want to be careful here about what I do with that information. It changes nothing about my own choices. I am not telling you this to redistribute the blame or to construct a narrative where I was also deceived and therefore less responsible for what I chose. I am telling you because it clarified something important about the story I had been telling myself. The version where Ren saw me fully, where what we had was a genuine and rare connection, where my needs were legitimate and my method of addressing them was merely flawed. That version required him to be something he was not. And understanding that he was not that thing helped me understand that what I had pursued, at such enormous cost, had been partly a projection. A story I needed to be true, built on a person who was considerably more ordinary than the story required. The ordinary truth of it was more devastating than any dramatic version would have been. Patrick and I did not divorce immediately. We went to therapy 6 months of it, which I am grateful for regardless of how it ended, because it gave us both the language for what had happened and what had been happening underneath. At it long before Ren, the therapist helped me articulate the flatness I had felt in year 5, helped Patrick understand that his response to discomfort was to solve it, and that this had, over years, made me feel that my emotional experience was a problem to be managed rather than a reality to be shared. We understood each other in those sessions better than we had in 8 years, and the understanding, which arrived too late to save the marriage, still mattered. Still matters. We separated in September. Amicably, as these things go, not because it didn't hurt, but because we were both, by then, operating from honesty rather than self-protection, and honesty, even painful honesty, produces a cleaner kind of ending than one built on continued management. I am 31 now. I live in a flat I chose specifically for myself, not too large, not a compromise, nothing that represents someone else's preference grafted onto mine. I am single, thoughtfully and without apology. I am in therapy still, because the work of understanding why I chose what I chose rather than choosing differently is ongoing and worth continuing. What I know now, what I know with the particular certainty of someone who has made every relevant mistake and examined it from every available angle, is this. The looking him in the eyes was the part that cost me most. Not the meetings, not the messages, not the 9 months of maintained surfaces. The eyes. Because the eyes were the place where honesty lived between us, the site of the specific intimacy that trust between two people produces. And I used that intimacy as a tool of concealment, which is perhaps the most precise definition of betrayal I have been able to arrive at. Betrayal is not just doing the thing. It is doing the thing while allowing the person to believe the thing is not being done. It is accepting their trust as a mechanism for your own concealment. That is what I did. I accepted Patrick's belief in me, and I used it against him every night for 9 months. I cannot undo that. I have stopped trying to undo it and started, instead, trying to be the kind of person who would not do it. Who would say, in year 5, I am feeling something I don't know how to name, but I know it means something is wrong between us, and I need us to sit inside that discomfort together rather than let me manage it privately until private becomes secret and secret becomes this. That sentence was available to me. Every night for 9 months, when I looked him in the eyes, it was available, and every night I chose not to say it. If you are somewhere in that choice right now, if you are managing something privately that the person across from you deserves to know, I am asking you to say the sentence. The real one. The hard one. Before the management becomes the thing you can no longer find your way back from. Because I know what it costs when you don't. Leave a comment. Tell me what you're sitting with, and I will see you in the next one.